The zoning map spread across my drafting table showed a discrepancy of 400 square feet, but it was the signature on the municipal variance that made my stomach tighten. The handwriting belonged to my older half-sister, Elaine. I had spent the last decade working as an architectural draftsperson in our declining industrial town of Oakhaven, tracing property lines and municipal borders, but I had never looked closely at the boundaries of my own family. I brushed a layer of eraser dust off the mylar sheet, feeling the familiar heavy ache in my lower back. I was 30 weeks pregnant, carrying a high-risk boy, and my medical insurance was entirely dependent on the Sterling Family Trust, an entity Elaine controlled with an iron grip. Our grandfather, Arthur Sterling, had built a modest empire of commercial warehouses and brick storefronts along Oakhaven's riverfront during the manufacturing boom. When he passed away, the properties were bundled into a complex trust. Because Elaine was 12 years older and already working in real estate, she was named the sole managing trustee. I was just the younger half-sibling, given a small fractional share of a residential account that barely covered my mortgage. I never minded the disparity. I preferred the quiet precision of architectural drafting to the aggressive posturing of commercial property management. My husband, Gareth, worked as a civil engineer for the County Water Authority, and together we lived a quiet, predictable life. But when my firm downsized and I was laid off just as my pregnancy complications began, that quiet life shattered. I needed the trust's insurance policy to cover the escalating hospital bills. Elaine knew this, and she used it to keep me perfectly aligned with her decisions. The friction between us had always been a quiet, simmering thing, usually managed by distance. That changed the afternoon Gareth and I announced we were expecting a boy. We decided to name him Arthur after our grandfather. It wasn't a calculated move. Gareth had never met the man, but he liked the traditional weight of the name, and I had fond memories of the quiet, meticulous man who used to show me how to read his compass and protractor. I sent Elaine a brief message with our decision, mostly as a courtesy. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. Elaine didn't offer a greeting. Her voice was sharp, carrying the metallic echo of her car's Bluetooth system. She told me I had to choose another name. When I asked why, she stated, with absolute authority, that she had claimed the name Arthur for her own future child. I sat in my drafting chair, confused. Elaine was 46, single, openly entirely uninterested in having children, and had spent the last 2 decades treating her property portfolio as her sole legacy. I pointed this out gently, suggesting that since we were actually having a boy in 2 months, it made sense for us to use the name. Her tone shifted from authoritative to frantic. She told me that claiming a family name was about hierarchy, not just immediate utility. She insisted that if I put the name Arthur on a birth certificate, I would be disrespecting the order of the family. When I refused to back down, telling her that Gareth and I had already made our choice, the line went dead. The next morning, the portal for my medical insurance showed my account as suspended pending administrative review. Gareth found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. We had a specialist appointment at the end of the week to monitor the baby's heart rate, a procedure that cost thousands of dollars out of pocket. Gareth placed his hand on my shoulder, his fingers pressing into the tense muscles. He suggested we just change the name. It was just a word, he argued, and my health was the only thing that mattered. I wanted to agree with him. It would have been the logical, easy path. But something about Elaine's reaction gnawed at me. It wasn't just spite. Spite is careless. Elaine's reaction had been precise, desperate, and immediate. People only react that way when a vital nerve has been struck. I decided to bypass Elaine entirely for the medical funds. The trust allowed beneficiaries to borrow against their own fractional shares for medical emergencies, provided they processed the paperwork directly through the holding bank. I gathered my medical records, the trust account numbers and my identification, and drove to the commercial branch downtown. The bank was housed in one of my grandfather's original limestone buildings. I was directed to the office of Marcus, the commercial manager handling the Sterling accounts. Marcus was a meticulous man who always looked slightly overwhelmed by his own filing system. He adjusted his glasses as I sat down and handed him the paperwork for a medical draw against my residential share. He didn't look at my papers immediately. Instead, he pulled up the Sterling Trust matrix on his monitor, his eyes scanning the lines of data. He let out a tired sigh, rubbing his temples. He looked at me and said the sentence that dismantled my entire understanding of our family. He said, "I assume you are here to restructure the collateral on the Arthur Sterling deed, now that the default notice has been issued." I kept my face perfectly still, my heart hammered against my ribs, echoing in my ears, but years of sitting in chaotic zoning meetings had taught me how to wear a mask of polite comprehension. I asked him to clarify, keeping my voice level, pretending I was fully aware of whatever he was talking about. Marcus turned his monitor slightly. He explained that the riverfront commercial block, the most valuable asset in the trust, was formerly known as the Arthur Sterling deed. He assumed I was stepping in because Elaine had leveraged that specific property for a massive commercial loan 3 years ago, a loan that had gone into default 2 weeks prior. The bank was preparing to seize the block. I asked Marcus to print the ledger for my records, claiming Elaine had asked me to review the figures before our next family meeting. Because I was a named beneficiary of the broader trust, he complied without suspicion. I walked out of the bank with a manila folder containing the financial architecture of Elaine's ruin. When Gareth came home that evening, I had my drafting table cleared of current projects. In their place were the bank ledgers, municipal zoning maps I had requested from the county archive, and a copy of our grandfather's original trust mandate, a document I hadn't read since I was 18. Gareth stood beside me, tracing the lines of the riverfront properties with a highlighter. Grandfather's trust was eccentric, I had always known that. But as I read the stipulations regarding the Arthur Sterling deed, a specific clause jumped out. The riverfront block was held in a provisional state. It was managed by the trustee Elaine, but the equity was legally earmarked for the first male heir bearing the founder's exact name. If an Arthur Sterling was born, the deed automatically transferred into a protected minor's trust, and the child's guardian would immediately become the financial executor of that specific property, superseding the main trustee. Elaine didn't care about a baby name. She cared about the audit. If I named my son Arthur, I would instantly become the legal executor of the riverfront block. As executor, the first thing I would be required to do was conduct a transition audit. I would immediately see the massive, unauthorized commercial loan Elaine had taken out against a property she didn't fully own. She had used the loan to fund a series of speculative real estate ventures in the next county, all of which had failed. The default notice Marcus mentioned meant the bank was coming for the collateral. If I gave birth to Arthur before the bank seized the property, the automatic transfer would trigger a fraud investigation, exposing Elaine to federal charges for embezzling from a protected trust. She needed me to choose another name, so the property would remain under her sole control, just long enough for the bank to quietly foreclose, wiping out the asset and burying her fraudulent loan in the ashes of a standard corporate bankruptcy. Suspending my medical insurance was simply a tactic to force my compliance before my due date. I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. I wasn't just fighting for a sentimental name, and I wasn't just fighting for my medical coverage. I was looking at the systematic theft of my son's future, orchestrated by a woman who demanded my gratitude while she robbed us. Gareth looked at the documents, his engineering mind quickly grasping the mechanics of the fraud. He pointed to a series of LLCs listed on the loan disbursements. He recognized the addresses. They were empty lots in the neighboring county, zoned for industrial use but abandoned. Elaine had funneled the loan money into shell companies she owned to buy worthless land, effectively washing the trust's money into her private accounts. We had the motive, and we had the mechanism. But bringing this to a lawyer immediately would trigger an injunction, freezing all trust assets for years. I would still lose my medical insurance right when I needed it most, and my son would be born into a protracted legal nightmare. I needed a surgical strike. I needed to remove Elaine without freezing the entire estate. I spent the next 3 days using my architectural software to build a comprehensive presentation. I didn't frame it as a legal complaint. I framed it as a municipal zoning compliance report. I mapped every parcel of the riverfront property, cross-referenced with the loan collateral documents from the bank and the shell company deeds Gareth had pulled from the county clerk. I documented every dollar that had bled out of the Arthur Sterling deed. When the presentation was flawless, I sent a formal email to Marcus at the bank, the head of the Municipal Zoning Board, and Elaine. I requested an emergency compliance meeting at the Municipal Planning Office, citing a critical error in the riverfront property lines that affected the bank's collateral. Elaine called me immediately. I let it go to voicemail. She texted, demanding to know what I was doing. I replied with a single sentence, telling her that if she wanted me to sign a waiver relinquishing the name Arthur, she needed to meet me at the planning office to notarize the agreement in front of the bank manager. She took the bait. The promise of my surrender was too tempting for her to ignore. The municipal planning office was a sterile room with fluorescent lights that hummed a low, persistent note. I arrived early with Gareth. My back was aching severely, a sharp reminder of the medical clock ticking down. Marcus arrived next, carrying his heavy leather briefcase, looking anxious about being pulled out of his branch. Elaine walked in precisely at 10 o'clock. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her expression arranged into a mask of weary patience. She looked at me, taking in my swollen stomach and the dark circles under my eyes, and offered a tight, condescending smile. She placed a legal document on the table. It was a formal waiver, drafted by her attorney, stating I would not use the name Arthur for any offspring in exchange for the immediate reinstatement of my medical benefits. She slid a pen across the table. She told Marcus this was just a bit of internal family housekeeping before we addressed the zoning issue. I didn't touch the pen. Instead, I unrolled a large architectural rendering of the riverfront block across the table. I weighed the corners down with the bank ledgers. I looked at Marcus and asked him to confirm the exact amount of the loan currently in default against the Arthur Sterling deed. Marcus, sensing the tension, hesitated, but his professional obligation won out. He stated the figure. It was just over $2 million. Elaine's smile vanished. She told Marcus to be quiet, reminding him of client confidentiality. I interrupted, pointing out that as a named beneficiary of the trust I had full right to the information. I then handed Marcus the county clerk records Gareth had found. I asked him to look at the ownership of the LLCs that received the loan disbursements. The room grew incredibly quiet. The only sound was the rustle of paper as Marcus flipped through the documents. The color drained from his face as he connected the dots. The bank had issued a loan against trust property, and the trustee had wired the funds directly into her own private shell companies. It was a textbook breach of fiduciary duty, and Marcus was the one who had approved the disbursements. His own job was suddenly on the line. Elaine stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. She directed her anger at me, her voice trembling with a terrifying, barely contained fury. She accused me of stealing documents, of misunderstanding complex real estate transactions, of being an ungrateful child trying to ruin the family that had fed her. She threatened to call the police, to have me arrested for corporate espionage. I let her speak, I let her exhaust her rehearsed outrage. When she finally paused to draw breath, I slid the grandfather's original trust mandate across the table, tapping the clause regarding the naming of the first grandson. I told her I wasn't there to argue about the money. I was there to inform the bank that the collateral they held was fraudulent because the trustee had violated the terms of the deed. I looked at Marcus. I told him that my son Arthur was due in 6 weeks. Upon his birth, the deed would automatically transfer. If the bank attempted to foreclose before then, I would personally deliver these documents to the state banking regulator, implicating both Elaine for fraud and the bank for failure to perform due diligence. Marcus understood his position instantly. The bank didn't want a scandal, and they certainly didn't want a federal investigation into their commercial loan practices. Elaine slammed her hand on the table, demanding I sign the waiver. She screamed that she had built the portfolio, that I had done nothing but draw lines on paper my whole life. The polished veneer was completely gone, leaving only the desperate reality of a person who knew she was trapped. I looked at her, feeling a strange, profound exhaustion replace my anger. I realized she had lived her entire adult life in a state of constant, miserable calculation, viewing everything, even her own family, as an asset to be leveraged or a liability to be managed. I pushed the waiver back to her. I told her the medical insurance was no longer her concern. Marcus, moving with a sudden decisive energy, packed the ledgers and the LLC records into his briefcase. He informed Elaine that the bank would be freezing all trust accounts immediately pending an internal fraud review. He stated that the bank would petition the probate court to have her removed as trustee by the end of the day, installing an independent receiver to manage the assets and protect the bank's position. Elaine looked from Marcus to me. The reality of the situation settled over her. Without her position as trustee, she had no leverage, no income, and a very real threat of criminal prosecution hanging over her head. She picked up her waiver, her hands shaking slightly, and walked out of the planning office without saying another word. The aftermath was a slow bureaucratic dismantling of Elaine's authority. The bank, desperate to avoid regulatory scrutiny, moved aggressively. An independent receiver was appointed within 48 hours. My medical insurance was reinstated immediately, funded directly from the trust's holding account. Elaine retreated to her townhouse, refusing to speak to anyone, hiring a criminal defense attorney to negotiate a settlement with the bank. She avoided jail by liquidating her private assets to cover the defaulted loan, effectively bankrupting herself to stay out of federal prison. 6 weeks later, my son was born. The delivery was complicated, requiring an extended hospital stay, but the medical bills were handled quietly and efficiently by the new trust administrator. We named him Arthur. A year has passed since that meeting in the municipal office. I never returned to my job at the drafting firm. Instead, the court-appointed receiver reviewed my analysis of the riverfront property and hired me as the project manager for the Arthur Sterling deed. Gareth and I have spent the last 12 months rehabilitating the old limestone buildings, preparing them for new commercial tenants. I keep a drafting table in a small office on the second floor of the main warehouse. The large window looks out over the river, letting in the heavy grey light of Oakhaven. Sometimes I sit there while little Arthur sleeps in his bassinet beside my desk. I unroll the fresh blueprints, tracing the solid, unyielding lines of the property, knowing that the foundation is finally secure. I thought securing the Arthur Sterling deed was the end of the nightmare. I believed that by exposing Elaine's fraudulent loan and forcing the bank to install an independent receiver, I had built a firewall around my family. The first few months of my son Arthur's life were deceptively peaceful. I spent my days in the makeshift office on the second floor of the riverfront warehouse, nursing him, while tracing the original limestone elevations of my grandfather's buildings. Gareth was working with the city engineers to update the ancient plumbing grids. We were rebuilding literally and metaphorically, but I had underestimated the sheer, desperate velocity of a woman who had spent 20 years defining her entire existence by the control of other people's assets. Elaine was quiet, but she wasn't defeated. She was simply changing venues. The illusion of safety shattered on a Tuesday morning in late October. The heavy wooden door to my warehouse office groaned open, and Thomas Vance walked in. Vance was the court-appointed receiver, a forensic accountant with the personality of a filing cabinet, but he was incredibly thorough. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply placed a thick, sealed manila envelope onto my drafting table, right over my blueprint of the HVAC schematics. He looked at me, then at baby Arthur sleeping in the corner, and his expression softened for a fraction of a second before returning to professional stone. He told me we had a problem, one that extended far beyond a simple defaulted loan. During his deep audit of the trust's historical tax filings, Vance had found a discrepancy in the property tax assessments for the 3 empty lots Elaine had purchased in the neighboring county, the Shell Company properties. They weren't just random, worthless industrial parcels. They were perfectly contiguous, forming a massive, uninterrupted footprint directly adjacent to a newly proposed state highway exit. And more importantly, Vance had found a secondary contract buried in the metadata of Elaine's archived emails. I opened the envelope. Inside were printouts of digital communications between Elaine and a prominent commercial developer based out of Chicago. As I read the highlighted sections, the true architecture of her plan revealed itself, and it was far more malicious than a simple embezzlement scheme. Elaine had never intended to just let the bank foreclose on the riverfront block to cover her bad loan. That was only step one. The Chicago developer had agreed to buy the defaulted riverfront deed from the bank for pennies on the dollar during a closed-door liquidation sale. In exchange, the developer was secretly funding Elaine's shell companies to buy the highway-adjacent land. Once the riverfront was demolished and replaced with luxury condos, Elaine would use the profits from her highway land, now exponentially more valuable, to buy her way into the developer's board of directors. She wasn't just stealing the family legacy, she was orchestrating its deliberate demolition to buy herself a seat at a much larger, more ruthless table. But there was a catch, and it was the reason Vance looked so grim. The entire deal with the Chicago firm was contingent on Elaine delivering the riverfront property completely free of historical preservation easements. My grandfather had drafted those easements himself, protecting the limestone facades from ever being altered. According to the documents Vance uncovered, Elaine had filed a petition to dissolve those historical protections, claiming structural decay. She had forged an engineering report to prove it. I looked up at Vance, my chest tightening. I told him that since she was removed as trustee, the deal was dead anyway. The bank held the loan, but the receiver controlled the property. Vance shook his head slowly. He explained that Elaine hadn't filed the petition as the trustee. She had filed it as the legal guardian of the heir. My blood ran cold. I asked him what he meant. Arthur was the heir, and I was his mother. Vance reached into his briefcase and pulled out a fresh legal summons, stamped by the county family court that very morning. He handed it to me with a heavy sigh. Elaine was suing for emergency guardianship of my son. I read the opening paragraphs, and a wave of nausea washed over me. Elaine wasn't relying on financial law anymore. She was weaponizing my medical history. The summons cited my high-risk pregnancy, my extended hospital stay, and the intense stress of the prior months. But she didn't stop there. She had somehow obtained access to the internal notes from the insurance portal, the very portal she had suspended, using my desperate calls and requests for coverage as evidence of severe financial and emotional instability. She painted a picture of a mentally fragile woman living in a construction zone, incapable of managing the complexities of a multi-million-dollar asset or providing a stable environment for a vulnerable infant. She was petitioning the court to step in as Arthur's guardian, strictly to manage his financial interests, which would immediately give her back the power to dissolve the historical easements and push the demolition deal through. I felt a primal, blinding rage that I had never experienced in my life. This wasn't about money anymore. This was a direct, calculated attack on my motherhood, on my sanity, and on the very safety of my child. I called Gareth. He arrived at the warehouse 20 minutes later, his boots covered in mud from a site inspection. He read the summons, his jaw muscles clenching so hard I thought his teeth might crack. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. Instead, he walked over to the bassinet, gently touched Arthur's cheek, and then turned to me with a look of absolute, terrifying calm. He said we were going to tear her apart. We had 48 hours before the emergency guardianship hearing. Family court in Oakhaven was a notoriously unpredictable arena, often swaying toward older, wealthier family members who presented an aura of stability. Elaine was counting on her tailored suits, her polished vocabulary, and my exhaustion to win the judge's favor. We needed more than just a defense. We needed to go on the offensive, using her own meticulously kept secrets against her. I realized that if Elaine had forged an engineering report to claim the limestone buildings were structurally unsound, there had to be a paper trail. You can't just invent a municipal engineering stamp. You have to hire a licensed firm willing to risk their accreditation for a bribe. I turned back to my drafting table. I pulled up the county permit database. I cross-referenced the date on Elaine's forged structural decay petition with every engineering firm that had filed permits in Oakhaven during that month. It was a massive haystack, but I knew what I was looking for. A firm that had suddenly received a large unexplained influx of capital, or one that was quietly connected to the Chicago developer. Gareth stood over my shoulder, scanning the names. He stopped me on a firm called Apex Structural. He recognized the name from his work at the Water Authority. Apex had been suspended from county contracts 2 years ago for falsifying soil samples on a public works project. They were desperate, legally compromised, and exactly the kind of firm Elaine would use. I looked at the digital correspondence Vance had provided. I searched the metadata for any hidden attachments or encrypted forwards. There, buried in a chain of mundane emails about office supplies, was a rooted IP address linking directly to the private server of Apex Structural's lead engineer. We didn't just have a theory anymore. We had the digital fingerprint of her forgery. But bringing digital metadata to a family court judge who barely understood email wouldn't be enough to dismiss a guardianship claim based on my alleged instability. We needed something visceral. We needed the original, unaltered structural report that proved the buildings were perfectly safe. A report Elaine must have hidden because destroying it would leave a gap in the trust's mandatory compliance records. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about how he organized his world. He didn't trust digital records. He trusted paper, ink, and iron. When he built these warehouses, he didn't just build storage. He built fortresses. I remembered a specific blueprint I had studied months ago, one detailing the foundation load-bearing walls. There was an anomaly in the sub-basement of the building we were currently in, a thick, reinforced void space that served no structural purpose. I looked at Gareth, and I told him to get his sledgehammer. The sub-basement smelled of damp earth and century-old mortar. The single halogen worklight we had dragged down the narrow concrete stairs cast long, jagged shadows against the foundation walls. Gareth ran his bare hand over the rough brickwork, referencing the blueprint I held under the light. We were looking for a seam, a disruption in the masonry pattern that matched the anomaly on the schematic. He found it near the eastern corner, where the mortar was slightly lighter, a different chemical composition than the original 19th century mix. Gareth hoisted the sledgehammer. The first strike echoed like a gunshot in the confined space, sending a shower of grey dust over us. He swung again and again, his breath echoing in the cold air until a jagged hole opened in the wall. The space behind it was exactly as I had drafted it on the screen, a sealed, dry cavity roughly 4 feet wide. Inside sat a heavy, fireproof document safe, the kind used in municipal archives before digital storage. Gareth used a crowbar to snap the rusted padlock. Inside the safe, wrapped in protective oilcloth, were not just my grandfather's original architectural renderings, but the comprehensive structural integrity reports commissioned precisely 3 months before his death. They were stamped by the county's most reputable engineering firm, certifying that the limestone foundations and load-bearing walls were viable for another century. Elaine had buried these original documents to create the vacuum she needed to insert her forged Apex structural report, but my grandfather had left something else in the safe. Folded inside the engineering binder was a notarized affidavit, signed by him and his personal attorney, explicitly stating that he suspected Elaine might attempt to dissolve the historical easements for commercial sale. The affidavit legally bound the trust to rely exclusively on the specific engineering firm he had hired for all future structural assessments. The family court hearing was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. Elaine sat at the petitioner's table, the absolute picture of composed, concerned authority. She wore a soft navy cardigan over a modest dress, abandoning her usual aggressive corporate suits to project a maternal warmth she had never possessed. Her attorney spent the first hour painting a devastating portrait of my life. He read carefully curated excerpts from my medical files, emphasizing the complications of my delivery and the sleep deprivation that followed. He described the warehouse where I spent my days as a hazardous, toxic environment, wholly unfit for an infant. He spoke in hushed, sorrowful tones, asking the judge to grant Elaine temporary emergency guardianship to protect baby Arthur from a mother who was clearly unraveling under the financial and emotional strain of a dilapidated estate. The judge, an older man with a tired, heavy face, listened intently, his pen hovering over his notepad. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and concern. Elaine's performance was flawless. She had weaponized my vulnerability so effectively that even I felt a momentary pang of doubt sitting in that sterile courtroom. When it was our turn, my attorney didn't call character witnesses or argue about my mental state. He called Thomas Vance to the stand. Vance, still acting as the court-appointed receiver, walked to the witness box carrying a single heavy binder. My attorney asked Vance to clarify the primary asset of baby Arthur's trust, Vance explained the Arthur Sterling deed, the historical easements, and the pending demolition deal with the Chicago developer. Elaine's lawyer immediately objected, claiming real estate transactions had no bearing on a child welfare hearing. The judge frowned, asking where we were going with this. I stood up from the respondent's table, keeping my hands perfectly still at my sides to hide the slight tremor in my fingers. I told the judge that my sister was not petitioning for my son out of concern for his welfare, but because she required his legal guardian's signature to commit municipal fraud. My attorney handed the judge the freshly unsealed affidavit from my grandfather, along with the original structural reports we had pulled from the basement safe. He then presented the forged Apex structural petition Elaine had filed to condemn the buildings, alongside the digital metadata, routing the forgery directly to Elaine's private server. The courtroom silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The judge put on his reading glasses. He spent 5 agonizing minutes comparing the original county engineering seals to the forged Apex documents. He read my grandfather's affidavit. Then he looked up at Elaine. The paternal sympathy in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a cold judicial fury. He asked Elaine's attorney if his client was prepared to explain why she had submitted a falsified structural report to the zoning board while simultaneously attempting to use the family court to bypass a dead man's historical preservation mandate. Elaine's polished facade cracked in an instant. She stood up, her voice shrill, insisting that the buildings were a financial sinkhole, that she was trying to save the family from bankruptcy, that I was too naive to understand commercial development. She didn't apologize, and she didn't feign maternal concern anymore. She simply raged against the loss of control. The judge didn't let her finish. He struck his gavel, denying the emergency guardianship petition with prejudice, but he didn't stop there. He informed Elaine that family court was not a venue for facilitating corporate fraud. He ordered the bailiff to detain her in the courtroom and instructed the court clerk to immediately forward the forged Apex documents and the digital metadata to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. Gareth reached under the table and took my hand. We watched in silence as the bailiff approached Elaine, who was now standing rigidly at her table, her face entirely drained of color, finally understanding that her own meticulous calculations had built the cage she was now locked inside. The subsequent months moved with a steady, quiet momentum. The district attorney indicted Elaine on multiple counts of forgery, perjury, and attempted real estate fraud. Faced with the metadata and my grandfather's affidavit, she accepted a plea deal that carried a mandatory state prison sentence, permanently barring her from acting as a fiduciary or holding a real estate license again. The Chicago developer, terrified of the criminal probe, completely abandoned the highway project, leaving Elaine's shell companies bankrupt and her remaining assets seized by the state to cover the legal penalties. I never went to the sentencing hearing. I had no desire to see her again. The space she had occupied in my life, previously filled with anxiety and defensive posturing, was finally empty. The court permanently appointed me as the managing director of the Arthur Sterling deed, operating under the oversight of Thomas Vance until my son comes of age. We finished the plumbing grids in the late spring. The original limestone facades, protected by the easements my grandfather fought so hard to leave behind, are currently being cleaned and restored to their original pale color. I spend my afternoons in the second-floor office, listening to the muffled sounds of Gareth directing the contractor crews below. The large window is open, letting in the damp, fresh smell of the river. Baby Arthur is sleeping in his bassinet, his breathing a steady, quiet rhythm in the room. I sit at my drafting table, unboxing a leather case I found in the safe alongside the documents. I take out my grandfather's brass compass and his heavy steel protractor. I lay a fresh sheet of mylar over the revised floor plans, adjusting the compass needle, and begin to draw clean, unbroken lines across the paper.
The visual representation of the Sterling Trust case provides a comprehensive breakdown of a complex family conflict, illustrating the profound intersection of financial abuse, psychological manipulation, and legal strategy. At its core, the narrative explores the weaponization of a family trust, transforming what should be an instrument of generational support into a mechanism of absolute control. The analysis begins by mapping this initial conflict, highlighting how the trustee leveraged a high-risk pregnancy and dependency on medical insurance to enforce compliance. This dynamic exposes a severe form of financial abuse where vital healthcare is treated as a bargaining chip. The psychological focal point of this stage is the dispute over the baby name, Arthur. While seemingly a sentimental choice honoring their grandfather, the name acts as a powerful catalyst. It reveals how naming conventions within established families often carry immense weight regarding hierarchy, legacy, and, in this specific instance, legal authority over a massive commercial asset. Moving from the emotional to the structural, the narrative shifts into a phase of critical discovery. The visualization captures the moment the protagonist steps out of her passive role and uncovers the architecture of her sister's fraud. By utilizing her skills as an architectural draftsperson, she maps out a massive breach of fiduciary duty involving a defaulted commercial loan and a hidden network of shell companies. This section underscores the inherent vulnerabilities of private family entities when authority is consolidated and unchecked. It highlights the social reality that white-collar crime within families is often masked by a veneer of corporate legitimacy. The actions taken by the trustee were not merely greedy, they were a calculated dismantling of the family legacy to buy her way into a more ruthless commercial sphere. The narrative then transitions to the counterstrike, showcasing a strategic approach that deliberately avoids emotional confrontation in favor of surgical legal action. Recognizing that a traditional lawsuit would freeze all assets and jeopardize her immediate healthcare needs, the protagonist frames her retaliation as a municipal zoning compliance issue. This highlights a crucial theme of empowerment through precise knowledge. However, the conflict escalates rapidly when the trustee changes venues, attempting to weaponize the family court system. The petition for emergency guardianship uses the protagonist's medical history to paint a false picture of mental instability. This tactic represents the darkest psychological element of the story, demonstrating how manipulators project their own desperation onto their victims and exploit institutional systems designed for child protection to facilitate corporate crimes. Ultimately, the resolution is found not in digital metadata alone, but in the physical, unyielding legacy of the family founder. The unearthing of a hidden document safe containing original engineering reports and a notarized affidavit symbolizes the triumph of tangible truth over fabricated narratives. The visual journey concludes by illustrating the establishment of a new foundation. With the corrupt trustee removed and facing criminal prosecution, the protagonist takes control, breaking a long cycle of cold calculation and exploitation. The ongoing restoration of the historic limestone buildings mirrors the rehabilitation of the family itself. By returning to the drafting table with her grandfather's original brass compass and steel protractor, she honors the true spirit of the legacy, ensuring that the foundation for her son is finally secure, built on transparency and genuine care rather than deceit and manipulation.